Stop share.
Great cast, Matt. Thank you.
I'm happy you guys stayed on. It's been almost 3 hours. My God, I guess you liked it.
And you didn't take a sip of water once.
What was that?
You didn't take a sip of water once.
Yeah, well, my mouth is pretty, that was the test.
Right.
But actually, you did have water here the whole time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please hurry with the upload. I'll need to listen to that many times, I think.
You know, in Australia, there's so many parallels to this experience that I just went through when you start looking at the Commonwealth as a whole and the Australian experience. There's so many parallels. It boggles the mind. It really does. And I'm hoping to write some material on the similar Ben Franklin networks in Australia as well.
Matt, who was the Prime Minister of Australia at the same time as FDR?
John Curtin. He was okay. He was okay.
That's what I heard. Yeah, he was. He instituted the policies in Australia that kept it alive as a country, basically, and saved it during the time. Otherwise, it could have been invaded by Japan, Imperial Japan. It would have been, or eventually, possibly. I mean, it would have faced eventually a war, a land war, directly with Japan.
I haven't started looking into that, but yeah. I mean, I know that he definitely saw a need for sovereignty, for using the Australian, to create and use the National Bank of Australia for the common good of the people. And before that could really get off the ground, he died, I think, a little bit under mysterious circumstances when he was in office. And it really wasn't until Gough Whitlam that you had somebody who tried to do something similar again, who was, as we know, ousted by the Queen's Governor General in '75.
Yeah, it's now raising himself from the dead.
Yeah. There was also a guy right before Whitlam who, I'm forgetting right now. I don't want to make this whole thing about Australia all of a sudden, but he also was an interesting guy who was an ally of Whitlam who died while swimming in a storm at night, and his body just never showed up. It was a weird story. Anyway, that's a whole thing I want to look into eventually. But,
all right.
He's the father of an actor as well, an actor that eventually went to America.
yeah?
Yeah, I can't remember his name, but yeah, it's very weird.
Yeah, I mean, no matter what you do, the as Lord Milner at the beginning of my class said in his quote, you know, like it wasn't Milner, it was Mackinder. If you go to my paper that I published this morning on the Vineyard of the Saker, I have this quote by Halford Mackinder from 1911 talking about Canada and Australia. And he made the point that if we cannot disrupt this flow towards collaboration between 1911 Canada and the United States, which was, again, this is a very different America from the Anglo-American beast that we know of as today. It's a very different thing. But if we can't stop that flow of collaboration, then not only will you have a U.S.-Russia alliance formed because there's a natural Arctic opening of development, but also that Australia would follow suit and break free of the British. And Halford Mackinder he's not like a little fish. You know, this guy's the founder of British geopolitics, a leading Fabian, and his ideas are still very dominant in the world. He's the guy who gave birth to Henry Kissinger, you know. So when you look at William Yandell Elliott, who was the Rhodes Scholar who was set up in Harvard to create sort of a round table, a Chatham House of Harvard, William Yandell Elliott is the guy who trained a young Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel P. Huntington, Pierre Elliott Trudeau of Canada. They were all indoctrinated by this Rhodes Scholar who was a follower of Mackinder. So the whole idea that you have like a Fabian society for the left and a roundtable movement for the right, it's bullshit. These two are inextricably interwoven.
The reason why I felt the need to divert a little bit briefly about the natives, I mean, yeah, there's the Chinese aspect, but there's also the Indigenous Australian aspect. And unfortunately, this whole narrative does feel, unfortunately, like Europeans' problems, unfortunately, just playing out in other people's lands and other people's cultures.
Can you say a bit more?
well, the native story doesn't play out much except as tools.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the problems in this whole thing, there's so many fallacies, but the way that history, at least following the Milner approach to creating a synthetic nationalism for Canadians, built upon it was built not upon a principle of loving freedom or something, because we didn't really have anything like freedom that we fought and died for. That never really existed in our experience. So rather than building that on something genuine, it was built upon a fear of fear of America specifically. And so they worked really hard, ironically, for the first 30 years from 1911 to 1949, 50, with Rockefeller Carnegie Foundation money, which was the primary funder of Canadian historians, funding anti-American narratives of our history, which, I'll let people work out that paradox, but it makes sense. But yeah, so they created a synthetic nationalism based upon a fear of America, and a we're not American. So that's your average Canadian. They look a lot and sound a lot like Americans, but they're totally psychologically really polarized against America.
Yeah.
Largely because America also doesn't play, it gives into its weaker traditions of empire as well, and acts like a jackass, which then feeds into by creating a Vietnam War or whatever, giving into, Wall Street takeover of something. It plays into that fear and fuels the fire. But part of it was also that the natives were just always wronged by Americans, whereas the British treated the natives well. And when you start getting down into the nitty gritty, you're like, okay, oftentimes, the British now and again did things to protect native interests, it seems, on the surface, but there was always a higher malevolent intention behind it. And they were always working with the Jesuits as well to deploy natives to conduct terrorist operations, and it's not the natives' fault entirely. Like they're being played with by these evil, racist geopoliticians who like using people.
That dichotomy is clarified in Australia somewhat because there wasn't really so much Australian independence. I mean, we're still part of the British Commonwealth. So the native story as a story of England being beneficial to the natives, that doesn't exist at all. So I mean, what you said about the false narrative of it being about freedom, etc. But we never really had, there was never really an experience of that. There's two things that come to mind. One of them is William James's nephew, some kind of polymath genius, who put forward the idea that the whole idea of American, and this is from Robert M. Piessig's second book, After Zen Automotive Soccer Maintenance, he kind of highlighted this, that put forward the idea that American characteristics that are specifically American in this good sense came from the Native Americans themselves. This kind of plain spokenness is actually plain speak because it's the language of the land of America. And there's another thing that comes to mind. There's this book called Tribe, where it speaks about Sebastian Unger, I think that's the author, where he talks about this happens at least in Australia, but maybe in the Americans as well, where the colonialists would every now and then just walk off out of civilization, so to speak, and go join the natives and never come back and never wanted to come back. And this really freaked out the authorities because they had no idea why they're doing that. And then when they found them and maybe even killed the tribe and brought them back, they would always run away again. And what a tribe makes the case is that freedom that didn't exist did exist in a kind of the belonging of tribe that the for whatever reason in English civilization had disappeared. And once they got a taste of that belonging again, they never wanted anything, even if it meant the comforts of a worn house that may not have been there in joining the Indigenous Australians.
Interesting.
Well, there's a parallel to that in the Dances with Wolves, right?
Yeah, it's true.
That's what I think of immediately when you're talking about this. Yeah.
Jerry, do you have any thoughts? I know you've written like four books touching on a lot of this stuff. Do you have any insights?
On which?
The native question.
Well, the point I would make is whenever the Americans were dealing with the indigenous people, the different nations, they called them Indians at the time. We shouldn't call them that now, but everything was done by a treaty. It was in writing. It was signed by both sides. Now, you can argue whether it was a good treaty or bad treaty for the indigenous people, but nonetheless, it was a legal document. The British did not do treaties with the natives. They basically would say, well, we want this from you. Here's some, fancy beads and some bright colored ribbon, and that's it. There was no documents. There's no treaty. Nobody signed nothing. Nothing could be proved. You couldn't talk about it later. So people who criticize the Americans for the way they treated the indigenous people are really, covering up for the genocide that the British Empire actually carried out.
Hmm.
That's the only thing I noticed, though. At least up until 1829 with that asshole Andrew Jackson, then it changed in
Right.
the United States. But prior to that, it was all done through treaties.
Right. Yeah, and Andrew Jackson was the guy who did the Trail of Tears, right, to empty out the southern states of all the native tribes that had lived there and just give it over to cotton plantation owners.
No treaty. Yeah, before that, the Americans never stole any land from the natives. It was always a treaty arrangement. Yeah.
Interesting. You also said something interesting to me the other day when you were telling me how the British went and artificially perverted or corrupted the entire social hierarchy of the natives by creating a merchant class, like by just putting all of their money into furs as the sole demand of the British. The natives then lost their pottery making capabilities, other things that they'd formerly organized their civilization around. They stopped doing that thing because the British were pouring tons of money into fur and nothing but. So that way, all of a sudden, the chiefs that normally had they're recognized as the authorities of the tribe, and all the social hierarchy was built around the chieftains and the councils. That was all swept aside as these new, I guess you could say, how would you word it? The people running the trade now became the profiteers, I guess, or the local gangsters of the natives. I don't know.
It was a change of leadership. It was the fur trade just destroyed the indigenous population, because prior to that you had your chiefs, your hereditary chiefs, and you also had your shaman, what do you call them, medicine man or whatever, but it was their cultural chief. And with the British institution of the fur trade, the person who could go out and catch the most furs and bring them back and trade with the British, his importance really rose up among that nation, so that it usurped the authority of the chiefs and the cultural leaders to whoever could, trap beavers.
Mm.
And it also destroyed their ability to produce anything. Before that, they made pottery and various things, bow and arrow. And after that, they lost the art of doing that because they could just trade with the British for it, for guns and for kettles, whatever they wanted. So the economy was totally dependent on the British. So if the British suddenly said, sorry, we're not going to trade any guns this year, well, the ability of that tribe to dominate others, because they had access to firearms and the others didn't, they suddenly lost that. So it was quite easy for the British to manipulate them around that point.
Right. I guess
So,
that's sort of what they did as well with the Indians on the opium trade too, right? By just well, first I guess tea, by just flooding the market, by just increasing the demand for tea, and then increasingly opium to flood into China. They just created local economies of crime syndicates within India that were then loyal to the British East India Company, and that were sort of like a dual deep state within India. That, and then they increasingly had their textile manufacturing capabilities destroyed as well, so that they just became focused on that one thing, opium and tea, and nothing else.
yes, one commodity. Same thing they did to the United States with cotton and the reinforcement of slavery to produce the cheap cotton.
Mm.
So that whereas the American system was based on diversifying your economy, so the more you improved in one area, it created free labor that you could then deploy into develop another aspect of your economy.
Right.
Which
Right.
is also what the Americans wanted to do with the indigenous people, is to give them access to the most modern technology, particularly in agriculture, so they could use modern agriculture methods, and to get them away from the reliance on the fur trade with the British, which was quite evil in its.
I guess that's sort of like what China's doing today in Africa by
Exactly.
offering advanced technology
Yeah.
and rail and things to the Africans. They're telling them you have an alternative to just being a resource extractor for the cartels of the West, but you can actually diversify your economies and create indigenous infrastructure.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that China's good intentions here might have a backfire effect of, again, doing a similar thing in terms of disrupting the existing traditional hierarchy of African.
How so? Do you draw more on that, Lionel?
In a similar way, I mean, but not necessarily out of obvious ulterior motive, like it sounds like the British do, but that kind of help creates a large change in society structure and in how culture reinvigorates itself after every generation.
So how does culture reinvigorate actually? Because this is what. Sorry, I don't know your name. The man who was just talking before.
Oh, that was Lionel.
No, not
Jerry.
Lionel.
Oh, Jerry.
Gary. Yeah, I just wanted to say, because we always talk about divide and conquer with empires and stuff, and I think it gets a bit like, well, it gets a bit overused and loses the value of its meaning. I think the British way has always been first taking control of the trade and making the economy of every nation dependent on one form of trade. And then through the degradation of the economy, they then employed the division tactic in culture. So those two pillars are standouts of empirical thinking, and that's where, like for me at least, like when I study what China's doing, the difference is absolutely opposite. Because okay, like what you say, Lionel, like there is a possible backfire from what China's doing, obviously, and we're actually seeing it through Western people who read The Economist or Financial Times, like how they're brought into this kind of reflective thinking that China is now a colonial power because they're doing the same as what we did. So they must be like us because, oh, well, we're human, they're human, we did it, they're going to do it. So this is the kind of trap that is created by creating this kind of Aristotelian, kind of finite thinking that everything will have some sort of adverse effect in the end. And this is where I just want to finish, like with China, I just would like to clarify that it's not just the building of infrastructure, there's the transfer of knowledge, there's training going on, there are schools being built, there is community projects being set up, there is social discussion taking place, there's also cultural exchange going on with the Confucius Institute in Nairobi, and most African cities now have a Confucius Institute, which I've been to some of them, like they engage in cultural activities basically between the peoples of those nations, and they're really profound. Like the days that they set up these places, they're really, especially when they're allowed to, when they're in a nation where they can actually kind of behave in a kind of free manner. Yeah.
I guess how I differentiate is, and again, this is independent of intentions, because I'm not saying that China has the same intentions as it sounds like the British did, but there's a kind of idea in Chinese of conquering through Wen and conquering through Wu. So one is through culture and one is through military, and they're not actually separate. And they're not saying one is good and one is bad. They're just different methods of the same thing. And to properly do the military one is good, and to properly do the cultural one is good, and to not quite do the military one very well can have very bad consequences, and to not quite properly do the cultural one can also have very bad consequences. And I think what differentiates it is either types of conquering through regenerating the existing indigenous population's roots, or from conquering through taking away in some form, accidentally or not, the indigenous people's roots to their own primordialness, let's say. I know that's very vague, but I think that's the best way I can put it.
Can I throw a question in there? What is their primordialness though? Like the natural, original, primordial state that you're talking about that's being removed?
No,
you don't mean that.
I mean,
you mean something else.
You don't want to be a traditionalist that just wants to go back in history. That's stupid.
Okay.
But essentially, to find the essence of how your own peoples are different to others, get in touch with that and bring that to a universalism in contact with everybody else.
Right. Well, I think that, yeah, that's a pretty good way of approaching it. And I think that, because there's this thing in the West, at least, that I often encounter. I see now that you're not thinking this way, but I thought maybe you were. But the thing that's contaminated a lot of our sociology departments has been this idea of natural fixed states of culture, which are indigenous, tribal, and natural. And it's really a delusion, because it's just taking like certain people in the Amazon or in Africa and just assuming that is like this noble savage or whatever. Like that's just like the natural state. But then when you actually start digging a little bit into like the Olmec civilization of 1000 BC in the Americas, or you look at like the Kingdom of Kush in 11th century Nigeria, you start seeing that a lot of these cultures they came from places where they had like Renaissance societies. Like the quality of art, architecture, and science and astronomy was so high. Something happened, it was lost, and now we happen to see these people at various times in what we might categorize as a tribal state. But you're like, no, wait a minute. There's these other. So the question is, like, are you, I think, doing things that are, because we know the British system is divide to conquer, and like Bernard Mandeville said, he exemplifies the British method very well, or the imperial method very well, of keep the minds of those you want to conquer as stagnant as possible, so the peasants are just satisfied just being without imagining a better way and not pursuing knowledge. That's what you want to put in is as much effort as possible, so that the elites who have the knowledge are the ones who can then really, really give into growing their vices naturally and satisfying their vices and having more vices, because the more of these hedonistic pleasures you give into, the more you get as an addiction. So that's like sort of the natural order for these Maria Abramovich Epstein types out there,
That's what you showed with the role of Quebec in your talk just now. How by what you were just saying, like the British, when they kind of make people their servants by like giving them a little bit of the pie, but like they keep the best parts for themselves.
Yeah, right. Well, the word there's this.
I feel a bit weird saying the British, because being British, I'm like, we're really good people. I'm really down here. But
yeah, I hear you, man. I feel you.
Well, on that, go ahead.
Wait, can I just say one thing on what Nick just said? Because there was something I didn't bring up, but there's a historian named Pierre Baudry who did some good work on Quebec that I used as my research, and he made a point that the word we have in Quebec, "enfourrapé," which means
Yeah.
kind of getting screwed over.
Yeah.
That literally,
Enfiroiper.
how do you pronounce it, Quan?
Enfiroiper.
Enfiroiper. It literally
Yeah.
derives from the 1774 to be wrapped in fur wrapped, and it became just a word. But
Oh, yeah.
the Quebecois knew that the British were just wrapping them in fur to make them all comfortable while they're getting screwed. It's a very rich word.
Yeah. Lionel, I would like to say that if you did not see the excellent video by the Schiller Institute, it was a lecture by Jason Ross. I think it's the future of Africa with China Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm.
In that lecture, Jason Ross truly put at the forefront the difference in attitude of the Chinese when they go to Africa. Is truly to bring something. I don't remember the name of the African statesman who said that everyone who came to Africa took something, but for the first time the Chinese came, they take things, they are taking things, but also they're giving things back. I think there's a difference here.
I understand. Like I say, it is very different. But I mean, look, the people in Australia that did the stolen generations, that saw the indigenous here were suffering, that were drunken and beating up each other and all that sort of thing, and abusing their children. Lots of good intentions, and they were giving a lot as far as they knew, and in material ways and in knowledge ways. Maybe the other side of just making them not allowed to speak their own language, that's not justified at all. But the good intentions and the love there is there. That's no question. Maybe there was manipulated by political forces and the English trying to do something on the wider scale. But as far as individuals are concerned, there's lots of good intentions, and the side effects are worse because of those good intentions.
Then it comes down to leadership, you would say?
Yes, but the Africans.
Yes, but depending what leadership means, I mean, what Kwame said in his lecture, if you're going to talk about leadership on which chakra level, because the highest chakra level of leadership understands the indigenous more than they understand themselves. Definitely not just understanding from your own perspective of what is good and what is of value.
Yeah, but speaking of leadership, Africans are now governed by their own leaders. The Chinese government has to go through the African leaders in order to do business in Africa.
But that's going back to what I was saying before, like just like with the fur, and just like with the disruption of how leaders are chosen within the own indigenous structure. What form of leadership is that? Is that true to those people's traditions or not? Like, yes, they're an African, they're from that country. It's hard to say if that's true to their essence.
I got a really cool thought, because sometimes this is why history is so valuable, and I love history. Nick will be going through a class on the Pan-African movement that was derailed. Because you're familiar, like in the 1950s and 60s, you had Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, a lot of people who participated in Africa in the Pan-African movement. Most of them were, suffered coups d'etats run by the CIA or assassinations, but there was something that they were tapping into that scared the shit out of the British Empire. Really strong, strong.
Like so strong. And everything you keep reading, it gets worse or better, whichever way you decide to look at it. But the battle was huge, and the intelligence that they divested into Africa was massive at the time. I mean, it's a real crossroads again that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that'll be a really, really useful class. And I was talking with Cynthia, and she's working on an article right now on Frederick Douglass and Lincoln. So I think we were discussing it. She'd like to, instead of her doing the Pan-Arab movement, instead she's probably going to focus on shaping a class around Frederick Douglass, the former slave who became Lincoln's advisor and the first ambassador to Haiti. And he had some very, very strong concepts, but I think that'll be the week before you speak. And he had some very strong ideas as well that were sort of a precursor to what Paul Robeson later did in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And what a lot of these Pan-African leaders like Cheikh Anta Diop were inspired by. But these are going to work really nicely in sequence, really, really nicely. And I mean, Jerry is going to touch a little bit on Haiti as well, and some of what people don't appreciate about Haiti becoming the second republic after America to break free of empire, and how some of Ben Franklin's key people were responsible for collaborating with former slaves in Haiti to do this. That also brings in France a bit, but it's going to be a really interesting story. So I think all of these classes, see, every week there's going to be a different dimension, different aspect of this picture, that it's all connected. And I think that coming out of it, we won't have like full answers to things, but we're going to have a really clear definition of the nature of things. And we can then like zero in on different problems with more refinement.
Another aspect of this was, I don't know if Jerry has any information on this, was the revolution in Paraguay, and how it shaped the history and the colonial, the current state of affairs, and now. Paul used to talk about this quite often and mention it, and I had never heard about this, but this happened in the same time period as the American Civil War, and it was organized by American system advocates. And I'd like to know more about it. I'm kind of intrigued because it's a vital part of the North American, American, that is North American, South American history and the shaping of it. You can imagine how South America would be completely different than it is now had Paraguay, the pro-American forces won in Paraguay, and how America would be completely different, and the Americas would be completely different had they won. So that's another key aspect of it. I don't know if anyone knows about this rebellion and war, but it was 1861 thereabouts, and all the imperial forces, the colonial powers of Britain, Spain, France, collaborated to gang up on Paraguay. The colonial powers within, like Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, I think probably Ecuador, all ganged up on Paraguay. So that's something to look into. I might just try in my researches, because it's a theme. We have a woman at work who's Uruguayan, and I just was explaining this to her, and it just seems like it's quite relevant coming up, a theme. It's very, very important, especially now for the, South America with the goings on in Brazil, part of the BRICS, and trying to reestablish itself as a key member of the BRICS alliance and get that transcontinental railway built, which will transform South America itself. Going back to the Jesuits in North America, one of this is a fundamental issue. Well, we have a North American guy who's a key leader, a key guy, archaeologist, turned out, because he was a linguist. His name is Barry Fell, and he ended up writing 2 or 3 books. One of them was called America BC, based on the archaeological evidence of Phoenician traders to North America that goes back as far as 1000 BC and probably maybe more, and corroborates, other archaeological items found that were taken and hidden by the Smithsonian, and various other battles that I've heard about, in archaeology in North America. And all part of it is as part of the Darwinian, I'll call it, legacy, British legacy, the Huxley legacy to enforce, the Darwinian outlook of the new racism against the natives. A simple-minded, backward people, and the whole notion of British, the isolationism, right? So Barry Fell, I read part of his book. There's about three of them out there. I recommend them to anyone who wants to learn more about the history, of that so crucial. And Galton is a key figure in this, who was the secretary under Jefferson, I think it was, or who really is it Jefferson, I think, who really enforced, started to really create this was a forerunner to Darwin's I think racism in America.
Are you talking about Galton, like Francis Galton?
Yeah, Francis Galton.
That was Darwin's cousin who set up the first eugenics congress.
There we are. Right. Okay. Yeah. And so there's a lot of so we're so there's another road to go down and investigate and whatnot. Another thing to point out, there's a great Canadian movie about the Jesuits in Canada and the battle between the Jesuits. It's called Black Robe. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I recommend it to everyone. And so, have a look.
I think that the whole question of the Jesuits is interesting because, I will watch Black Robe, actually. That does look kind of good. And another one that tackles the Jesuits in a positive light is the Mission. With Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. It's actually a really good movie. And I think that there's probably a lot of truth in that, even though, because the Jesuits are sort of a mixed bag. There's a lot of Jesuits who did a lot of good, whether it's in China or in the Americas. It's undeniable that a lot of them sacrificed they gave their life to making things better for people. And they're very rigorous. Some of them have been very loving. But there's also, coexistent with the lower level Jesuit, there's a seeming like hierarchical system of almost like a Freemasonic mystery model from the top. And if you go to the upper echelons, it gets really insidious. And there seems to be a general policy where on the lower level, good Jesuits like Matteo Ricci or Leng Shening of China will do a lot of good things. Or in France, New France as well. But then I think when you look at Ignatius Loyola's 1536 spiritual exercises, there's some stuff in there that sort of predates Bertrand Russell's efforts to try to convince his victims that snow is black, where they actually, one of the lessons for the Jesuit discipline is if God wills that right be wrong or white be black, it is so. The thing is, who is the person to interpret God's will to you? Do you have a personal connection? No, there's like a black pope, a Jesuitical hierarchy of a certain pope, as far as I can see, but that's not the pope. It's like, a head of their Society of Jesus that interprets things and then gives commands according to a lot of discipline logically. So they have a lot of discipline in their mind, but they're obedient to irrationalism as an organizing force. They will do evil as if it were good, but they'll be disciplined along the way. And that's why I think Cecil Rhodes in his seventh will said that in creating a new religion of the British Empire, we have to model it on the Jesuitical constitution, because that's what he wanted the Rhodes Scholarship system to be, was something that had the discipline. And these Rhodes Scholars, they're the best of the best in many ways, of their Ivy League campuses when they get their scholarships. They've got a lot of talent. But they work them in Oxford to just have a whole organized set of quasi-discoveries, or things that look like discoveries, but they feel like discoveries, but they're not. They're set up, to get a certain like artificial eureka in the mind of the kid, while at the same time falling under obedience of something like, a post-nation state world order controlled by a master class that must rule, because the plebeians are too, intrinsically corrupt to control themselves as cattle. So you have to, unfortunately, have a global governance technocratic regime or some shit. But yeah, so I think that there's something there. Definitely, though, the connection between, and Christine actually was just reading a book on the battlefield of the mind. No. Yeah, Battle for the Mind. That's it. By William Sargent, who was a Tavistock affiliated psychologist who worked in London and was tied to MK Ultra and these things in the 50s. And he spends a lot of time focusing on the Jesuits and how much you can learn by the Jesuit system of indoctrination. She was taking a lot of notes, and I'm looking forward to her upcoming paper on this.
Well, it reminds a lot the organization of Freemasonry.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
I think the Jesuits tend to be a little bit more disciplined than what I've seen from my studies of Freemasons, who tend to get a little bit more into the hedonistic mysticism to an extreme degree.
Yes,
like they take their symbolism really far, whereas the Jesuits don't seem to be that big into symbolism.
Yes, but the Freemasons began in the 18th centuries, and the aristocrats at the time were too degenerate compared to the 17th century Jesuit aristocrats.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's an interesting point.
Yeah. Matt?
Yeah, Jerry.
I think the other point also with the Jesuits is to remember what they were used for. The whole intent of the oligarchs in Europe was to stop the American colonies from actually going west, right? That you had to keep them trapped between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. You couldn't have them go past that. So that the Jesuits were used to organize the native tribes to constantly attack the Americans on their western flank. And the interesting thing is, once the British defeated the French, 1763, and the British then ran Canada, and the Jesuits were no longer there, the British set up the British Indian Department and did exactly the same thing with the natives to attack the Americans on their western flank. So the intent was exactly the same, whether it was the Jesuits or whether it was the British Indian Department. It was almost like the British oligarchs and the French oligarchs had this secret plan that we have our differences and we're going to fight forever, but we have one thing in common, and it's to stop the American colonies from going west.
Well, this is where the work by Edgar Allan Poe on his Eureka essay is so interesting, because Poe is like zeroing in on these two different oligarchical factions of the Aristotelian and the Baconian sort of Protestant sort of veneer, and the Aristotelian that had sort of been used in the Catholic Church to, you know, and both of them sort of were trying to impose false maps of reality onto the minds of their victims, either through creeping or crawling, you know, just blind faith in general rules that you cannot question, and then you have to fit all of your world into those blind axioms that are unquestionably assumed. You just have to assume blindly, right, as your first rule of life. And then the Baconians, the school of Hogg, that Poe calls it, were of the view that no, you can't know generalities or universals. All you can know is your senses, and maybe you'll find a pattern, get lucky, and you could extrapolate onto the universe what your senses tell you, and that's your pathway of inductive reasoning. So you got deductive or inductive. He's like, no, scrap it. Neither one. Both actions can be useful, but don't be limited by either. Like, you have to introduce this poetic, creative reason aspect. And he does it so well in his essay. It's really great. But he's doing what Ben Franklin's doing, or Leibniz. They're all poetic scientists. They're not limiting themselves to the one
He
school or
also
another.
writes a little short story on that same theme from Eureka. Just that one little part he makes into a short story.
Malona Tauta.
Yeah, on board the balloons.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah, that's fun. I feel like Brian. Are you alive, Brian? Okay, it's a frozen image of Brian in the past. Okay. I was like, every time I look down occasionally at Brian just to see he's blinked.
Yeah. It's the picture. It's not him. It's just,
That's hilarious. Hey guys, I think let's that's funny. Hey, let's wrap this one up. And for those who can make it, like I said, Anton Chaikin is doing his amazing class on Sunday at 7, where he's going to go through a lot more in detail of Ben Franklin's work in London with the Lunar Society and his creation of a British Republican humanist movement that has been completely scrubbed out of history. So he's going to go do that, probably a little bit more, and it'll be a lot of fun. So that's Sunday at 4 p.m.
okay, did you say 4 or 7?
I said 7 and I lied. 4. 7. Sunday at 4
4 is better. Okay.
Eastern Standard Time. Okay, amigos. It was super fun. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks, Matt.
See you
Thanks,
Sunday.
guys. Great presentation.
Cool. Thanks.